pride and vanity. One can boast the feeling of satisfaction, but can also blind us to our faults. The other can expel arrogance or conceit that does nothing but hinder. These are traits that have caused some to underestimate their enemies and overestimate themselves. In 1879, the British underestimated the Zulus, leading to a defeat that shocked the empire. The Romans overestimated their own forces, fighting the Celtic and Germanic tribes, therefore ceasing their northern expansion. Even in the 2200s, hundreds of years later, the same mistakes are being made. The first legate of the infamous Caesar's legion during the First Battle of Hoover Dam made such a mistake that would not only tarnish his position, but give birth to a new man. His name was Joshua Graham. According to unconfirmed sources, the ruined city of Ogden in Utah became home to a group of settlers that painstakingly tried to build a new community. That community was New Canaan. Not much is known of New Canaan before 2077, but by that year, it was a prosperous town and home to an aspiring missionary called Joshua Graham. New Canaan was a religious Mormon town that rose to prominence in northern Utah, controlling the major trading routes north of the Mojave Desert. Unlike most religious cults of the wasteland, the New Canaanites were respectable, fair people and good fighters. It is said that learning to use a .45 automatic pistol was a New Canaanite rite of passage, a rite that Joshua Graham himself would be well versed in. In 2246, Graham left his home to venture out and spread the word of God across the wasteland. As tribes and new dialects begun springing up across North America after the Great War, his fluency in several dialects made him a perfect candidate for the job. He followed the I-15 and Highway 89 south to Arizona. There he came across the Grand Canyon, and within it, members of the secular humanist organization, the Followers of the Apocalypse. The followers had been sent out to study and educate the various tribes that had emerged in post-war America, of which there were many across the Southwest. Joshua decided to help the followers with their mission. His aptitude for languages would prove a useful addition, though later for purposes none of them intended. Two of the followers were Bill Calhoun and Edward Solo. In 2247, the followers and Graham journeyed into Arizona to find the Blackfoot tribe, which they did. At first, things seemed to be going friendly, but something soon changed, and the tribe held them hostage. To this day, it is unknown what exactly happened. Whether Graham mistranslated or they were tricked is unclear, but what is clear is that the Blackfoots were not the most capable fighters, and the war against 7 other tribes they were embroiled in was being lost, and fast. Edward Solo decided that he wasn't going to fall prey to another's war, and against the wishes of his companion Calhoun, he took charge and began teaching the Blackfoots about warfare. Using the knowledge he gained from the followers, he showed them how to keep their weapons clean and preserved, taught them about small unit tactics, and how to actually use firearms effectively. All the while, Joshua served as his interpreter. Thanks to aid from Solo, the Blackfoots prevailed in their war. He was proclaimed their leader, and something awoke inside him, and eventually Graham. Before long, tribe after tribe fell to join Edward's ranks, such as the Kaibabs and the Fredonians. Edward came to the conclusion that this array of tribal identities needed to be eradicated and unified under a single banner. One culture, one identity, one legion. Along with Graham translating, which before long became giving orders, which became leading in battle. Edward established a confederacy of tribes that, upon it being big enough, crowned himself Caesar, and carved out his own single great tribe, his legion. Bill Calhoun was sent back to the followers of the apocalypse to inform them of what had happened, and that Caesar should not be interfered with. Joshua Graham, however, became his first legate. For around 30 years, Caesar's legion spread across the old four-states commonwealth that consisted of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. Under the command of Caesar, tribe after tribe fell into line and was assimilated into this one culture. If they never knelt, they were destroyed. Decades of war and constant expansion turned the legion into a loyal, hardened, powerful and cruel society, where Joshua Graham was at the helm alongside Caesar. By 2271, Caesar's legion consisted of 86 tribes, and the first legate had established for himself an infamous reputation among those both in the legion and outside it. He may not have been the finest leader and became unpredictable, but he was fierce, dangerous, brutal, and terrifying to friend and foe alike. He trained legionaries, punished those sentenced, and terrorized anyone who was in the legion's path. The atrocities and mistakes he made would not haunt him. He wielded fear as a spear for the legion that cut through their enemies. He had lost his way from the path he had set before him earlier. He threw out the Bible, took his .45 pistol, adorned his Salt Lake City Police Department armor, and fought not in the name of God, but Caesar. His leader's endless ambition to see the wasteland united under the bow led to the legion eventually expanding into the Mojave Desert. Spanning the Colorado River was Hoover Dam, a strategic asset and river crossing, for across the expanse was the great shining city of New Vegas. However, they found that a power rivaling their own had already arrived, and soon set its sights eastward. Scouts from the extensive Democratic Federation, the New California Republic, reported that the dam was more or less intact, and more than capable of producing huge amounts of power. Suffice it to say, the dam was a greatly desired asset for all the powers in the Mojave. Following the New Vegas Treaty between the self-styled president of New Vegas, Mr. House, and the NCR, the Republic began to establish a major presence in the area, taking over Hoover Dam and setting up base at McCarran Airport by 2275. Caesar was infuriated by the NCR's presence, and around 2277, the Legion set up operations at Fortification Hill on the eastern side of the dam. Troops gradually assembled, and soon the two powers were entangled in a violent conflict. Graham soon became infamous among the ranks of the Republic's vast army, and while he was known as a menace, he was also known for being impossible to kill. Many within the NCR knew him to be the toughest son of a gun they'd ever seen. Even NCR Rangers and the elite 1st Recon couldn't kill him. In the early days of the war, his death was reported 5 times, and yet he still lived. The legendary legate was a boon for Caesar, but for Graham, it all came crashing down after the first battle of Hoover Dam. In 2277, the Legion under the command of Joshua Graham launched a massive assault on the NCR at the dam. The legate positioned all his troops onto the structure, but General Lee Oliver's soldiers were able to hold the Legion at the center of the dam. Soon after, the Rangers and 1st Recon began picking off Legion officers, until Graham ordered the veteran troops to push through the recruits, causing chaos and confusion. and forcing Oliver's force to retreat onto the side walkways. It was initially a success, though a costly one for the legionaries, as the veterans managed to push the NCR back to nearby Boulder City, and that was the plan. Chief Hanlon of the NCR Rangers anticipated that the legate would use his men in their usual fashion, which they did. Graham made the mistake of treating the NCR as another tribe, and overestimating his own forces, being an inept tactician and strategist. The Republic initiated a tactical retreat to Boulder City, fooling the legate that they were routing. As the Legion approached the city, the NCR vacated, and before Joshua realized what was happening, the entire town exploded around them. The NCR had trapped the settlement with C4 and dealt the Legion a crushing blow, eliminating veteran warriors and causing disorientation amongst those remaining, therefore allowing the Republic to instead route the Legion back across the river. Graham survived and fled back to Caesar. Little did he know, it would have probably been better had he surrendered to his enemies, for as far as Caesar was concerned, you return victorious or die trying. Their defeat at the First Battle of Hoover Dam was the worst loss in the Legion's history, and Caesar did not tolerate failure, even at the highest level. He blamed his first legate and longtime companion Joshua Graham for what had happened, and, to set an example, ordered his Praetorian guards to cover the now ex-legate in pitch, set him ablaze, and had him thrown into the Grand Canyon. Legate Lennius was his replacement, and for the next 4 years the Legion focused on recovering its strength and prepared for a second battle. However, superstition began to run rife throughout the imperialistic slavers as Graham survived. The ex-legate awoke at the bottom of the chasm the next morning after his burning. With perpetual agony, he crawled out, burned, broken and betrayed. There was no pride, no vanity nor feeling of being left in him. All he wanted now was to go home, if home would even accept him. It took him 3 months to return to New Canaan. With every day, perhaps with each step, pain burned throughout his body. He apparently became immune to chems, only Stimpaks ever worked. His burns gave him constant agony, a nasty reminder of his past and the ramifications one's actions can have. He eventually covered himself in bandages from head to toe, of which had to be replaced daily so he could avoid infection. Though he moved beyond Caesar's gaze, his old friend knew he survived, as did others, for sightings of the burned man began to spread across the east. Though assumed dead by most, he became a myth, his despair elevating him to a mythical status that struck fear into the hearts of legionaries and even some outside of Caesar's service. Even years later, Caesar forbade anyone to speak his true name under the penalty of death. Rumours of his survival or even mention of the burned man were put down by higher-ranking legionaries, but those of the lower ranks and slaves often spoke of the burned man as a spirit filled with vengeance that awaited its moment to bring the entire legion down. Caesar began sending scouts and assassins to try and hunt down Graham, and patrol the territory east of the Colorado River for any sign of him. He was to be killed on sight. Over the next 4 years, numerous members of the Legion would fall to the burned man, further cementing his myth and belief of his existence. When he finally arrived at New Canaan, the town welcomed him with open arms and love, as if everything he'd done didn't matter. He later deemed that it was their love that was the fire that burned within him, and his God's love. Thus his faith was rekindled, and ever since, he tried to repay his debt to both of them. New Canaan had continued to prosper and remain independent in the years during the NCR and Legion's expansion. Eventually, the Mormons came into contact with the rapidly expanding NCR and its very influential Crimson Caravan outfit. Soon, the caravans of New Canaan and the Crimson Caravan became competitors, but by 2281, the New Canaanites permitted the NCR-based traders to set up a trading post within the settlement, but at the cost of hefty taxes. Although, while the New Canaanites were decent fighters, they could not have been prepared for what was coming. Joshua Graham's past. The Whitelegs. A primitive nomadic tribe in northern Utah had for a while been a problem for New Canaan, but it was Joshua's arrival and, to an extent, the dissolution of the Desert Rangers that tipped the balance. The Whitelegs desired to join Caesar's legion, and as a rite of passage, Caesar had them wipe New Canaan and all who dealt with them off the map, determined to destroy all traces of the burned man. With aid from the ex-Legion scout, Ulysses, the Whitelegs attacked the settlement at night while Graham was away with a number of its defenders. They succeeded in destroying the town, spreading salt upon the earth so that nothing would grow, and burning the leader, Bishop Mordecai, alive. Although, around 30 survivors managed to escape, including Graham and a Mormon missionary called Daniel. The refugees scattered across the wastes, and Joshua and Daniel made their way to Zion Canyon. But so too did the Whitelegs. Zion. Practically untouched by the decimation of nuclear fire and post-war violence. It was a ground of natural beauty and God's truest work for Graham. It was a land worth fighting for, but the worst of his impulses were only fueled by the destruction of New Canaan. In Zion, there was one main tribe, the Sorrows, descendants from the children that survivalist Randall Dean Clark protected. Daniel settled in with the Sorrows, though at some point, Graham visited an old tribe for a second time. As a legate of the Legion, he ventured to Dead Horse Point State Park and visited the Dead Horses tribe, descendants of refugees. At that point, the Dead Horses were ready to follow Graham and Caesar, but they didn't. Now, years later, after the destruction of New Canaan, Graham returned and convinced a large group of them to migrate to Zion Canyon and help the Sorrows stand against the oncoming Whitelegs. Graham became their war chief and spent much of his time defending the valley by various means. Like Caesar had done with the Blackfoots years earlier, Graham taught the Dead Horses the art of warfare, how to fight, how to maintain weapons, etc. As Caesar wanted everything to do with Graham wiped out, the Sorrows having dealt with New Canaan before, and the Dead Horses once visited by him as a legate, and now their leader, were simply more targets for the Whitelegs to appease Caesar. If only they knew how grueling it would be to eliminate the burned man. Not even Ulysses tried when he could. While the Sorrows were a friendly, peaceful tribe, the Dead Horses were a somewhat stubborn, cautious bunch with a warrior-based culture. Their reason for being in Zion was to fight the Whitelegs, though fight is not the term Graham would use in this conflict. He desired to bring the Whitelegs and their leader, Salt Upon Wounds, to justice for what they had done, and for his God. He sought a burning vengeance for his people that were killed, that was only fueled further by his personal demons and a desire for redemption for his past. For all that Caesar had done, Graham never blamed him, only himself. He may have even forgiven Caesar to some extent, yet despised everything his old friend had built, an empire of sin. The Legion had become a totalitarian culture dominated by a single man and his endless vision to unite the wasteland, no matter the cost. Internally, there was a struggle about what burned inside of Graham, light that illuminated or fire that consumed. Daniel feared that with the dead horses and Graham's lust for vengeance, the burned man had created or was on a path to create something similar to Caesar's Legion. Daniel wasn't necessarily worried about fighting, but the type of warfare Graham was conducting. It was about extermination rather than simple defense and vigilance. Yet Joshua knew and wanted others to know that this was always about exterminating their enemies, for he knew tribes such as the Whitelegs would never stop, regardless of the obstacles in their path. Daniel wanted Graham and the dead horses to fight, but only to give the others time to evacuate Zion and block the passage behind them, losing the Whitelegs in the wilderness. Graham, on the other hand, wanted the tribes to stand their ground and wipe out their enemy, bringing God's justice to them as well as satisfying his lust for revenge. This caused the pair to be at odds, with Daniel fearing that the war against the Whitelegs was bringing out the worst in Graham, possibly resulting in undesirable long-term consequences. The plan to flee or fight for Zion was almost ready to be put into action, but amongst other things, this small internal struggle brought everything to a halt. The factor that broke the stalemate, that would go on to decide the future of Zion and its inhabitants, was none other than the courier who was shot in the head. Around 2281, a Happy Trails caravan led by Jed Masterson travelled through Zion on their way to New Canaan. If only they'd known the Mormon town was destroyed, and of the danger that awaited them as they entered the former national park. The caravan was ambushed by Whitelegs, and all but the courier who was travelling with them perished. A young dead horse's scout, Follows Chalk, met the courier and guided them to the tribe's camp in the Eastern Virgin River, where Joshua Graham himself checked and assembled weapons for war. Graham tasked the courier with helping them with the final preparations for what was to come. Nearly all of the tribesmen considered the pre-war structures of Zion taboo and would not dare enter them for the supplies they needed. The courier was eventually introduced to Daniel and the Sorrows, and began to learn fully about the confusion between the missionary and the burned man. The courier at Daniel's request searched Zion for the last things needed for whatever the final event was to be, such things as locating a map of the Grand Staircase region, the elimination of Whiteleg scouts, the disarming of traps, but the most important task arrived when the moment came for them to decide the future of Zion Canyon. To this day, we don't know what exactly became of Joshua Graham, Daniel, the dead horses, the Sorrows, nor even the Whitelegs. We don't know if they fled, whether or not they fought and defeated their enemies, or even if Salt Upon Wounds was killed or spared. But whatever happened, it would surely have affected the region, the tribes and those around them, what was left of the New Canaanites, and the legend of the burned man himself. Joshua Graham had led a long, dark and troubled life, but one filled with moments of good, which indicate that even monsters can be changed when it appears too late. Then again, depending on what happened in Zion, perhaps people never really change. Perhaps the fire that burns within them is not one of hope, but depravity and hatred. Graham's life with the tribes of Zion may not have been the same as the Legion, but there were similarities that made Daniel's anxiety unsurprising. Joshua Graham was both feared and admired by the dead horses. Some idolized the burned man, as is evident by their chalk art across Zion. While the Whitelegs and Salt Upon Wounds didn't help the former legate move on with his faith, and no longer revel in cruelty and brutality. It was men like he and Caesar who created those like the Whitelegs in the first place. Joshua Graham's legacy, his story, is one that a number of messages can be siphoned from. That karma exists and always comes back to bite. That redemption is possible for even monsters and men like Graham. That legends are fueled by the actions they speak of. Or that deciding when to fight and when to not is not always clear. But one thing that we can take from all of this is that we all have a choice. And being honest to yourself about your motivations is important. Graham chose to fall in line with Caesar for many years, and later suffered the ramifications of that decision. He had to lie to himself to rationalize what he did, and even though he had time to reflect and take a different path forward, he still remained ignorant of his truest issue: warfare. Joshua Graham was the perfect example of what decades of war can do to a person, and that mercy can be liberating for the soul. But the wasteland is an unforgiving place where the weak are consistently battered, and violence is almost always the solution. Yet, it is moments like those in Zion with Joshua Graham that can define how humanity moves forward, either with a shield or a sword.